start with talking about COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
That's what really inspired this whole conversation series in the first place. Was I wanted to have the opportunity to reach out to the people in my network who I very much trust and love talking with and learn from and feel inspired by and feel motivated by. And I was like, who are those people? And you were one of them. And it's important in this time of probably the most severe and confusing crisis that I've ever experienced, to be able to have these conversations. And it made sense to be able to share it with others. And what I really wanted to have a chance to do was this is a very casual format type of these video podcast. But it's just a chance to start to talk to you about what have you been thinking about? What research have you seen or been engaged in around making contribution of making sense of COVID-19?
Oh gosh, yeah. I can jump right into that. I mean, I think a lot of people ask me this question of, does your research help us better tackle COVID-19? Or what part of the research helps you do it? And my answer is everything and nothing at the same time. And so let me try and sort of unpack that a little bit in the sense that I do believe that a lot of what I study, things like behavior change, nudging, mental accounting, are all potentially useful tools to help us steer behaviors in the appropriate direction, be they in the domain of wearing masks or social distancing or complying with other elements of the health guidelines, or even making sense of data, I think. But as you know, one of my biggest kind of points that I've tried to make over the last couple of years is the importance of context, and that we need to be careful of not simply treating our research in the journals as an off-the-shelf solution. So just because I showed in a 2010 paper that A causes B doesn't mean that A is always going to cause B. And so I guess sort of the broad point I want to make here is that I think a lot of the conceptual ideas that I've done in my research on behavior change in particular will apply to helping us understand, A, how do we get people to comply with health regulations? B, how do we help them understand and make sense of the world? And C, how do we think about organizations and how they should adapt to functioning in a COVID-type era going forward. But again, I mean, at best, we can offer sort of a starting point for the research. The past is great; it's a decent predictor of the future. But unless we test those ideas in this particular domain, right? So let me give you one quick example of the kinds of things that I'm working on, right? Which is the idea of conflicting information. Okay, so. This is particularly true in the United States. We saw a little bit of this in Canada in the early stages of the pandemic, where Minister A would say, go away and enjoy your March break. And Minister B said, wear a mask, stay inside, social distance, right? So we've often heard conflicting pieces of evidence. And these have often been also in the domain of science. So we've had a paper that shows that hydrochloroquine helps COVID resistance, and another paper that shows it hurts COVID resistance. So how do I make sense of these pieces of data? And I think, you could actually start hypothesizing many things. There's an averaging model where the average consumer says, well, look, this one showed a positive effect, that one showed a negative effect. So maybe overall there's no effect at all, right? Or there could be a trust issue, right? Paper A was written by Kelly, who I trust. Paper B was written by someone I don't know, and so I'm going to go with the trust, right? Or you could have an anchoring and adjustment kind of an issue where I rely first on the evidence that I see first, and then I keep updating that. So we've been actually trying to tease apart which of these three things, and I think our early results suggest that it's actually none of these. It shows a distrust kind of a model, which is, these guys can't even get their act together, so why should I believe any of them? And I think that's a slightly frightening thing to find out. I mean, again, I don't say this as a definitive conclusion, but I think that's one stream of research. We've also been working with a couple of companies on sort of pivoting processes and products online. So things that were currently offline processes, wealth management, or the sales process. How do we now change that to an online process. And I think that's an important behavioral story right there, because there's a strong managerial tendency to essentially take what you've been doing in the offline world and recreate it online. And I think that's a mistake. And I can chat a bit more about that if you like.
Yeah, let's talk about that conversion to online. I mean, we've been looking at the challenges of digital transformation has been talked about for, it's well over a decade. I mean, it started with the e-commerce journey, but digital transformation picked up more steam. That first generation was about creating that .com capability. Mm-hmm. Digital transformation includes everything from having that hybrid and cross-channel approach. I had a very interesting conversation with a retailer about her challenge in digital transformation, and I'd love to hear your point of view on that, as well as see how that fits within the rest of the conversion topic that you've been working on. She said that dealing with Amazon, for instance, has been her stress over the last 5 years. Mm-hmm. Figuring out where their brand fits in with Amazon as both a distribution partner, but also as a competitor in a new competitive set. And they've been navigating their way through that. But what COVID-19 has done has very much shifted the retail distribution channel, because now consumers are also thinking, which channel do I feel safest in?
Correct.
And this is now changing that option set yet again. So I'd love to hear the kinds of things that you're thinking about around digital transformation.
Sure. So let's start at the basic. And so if I kind of go back and look at the question of the competition with Amazon, I mean, clearly, the marketing 101 response is your value proposition needs to be so compelling that, this whole notion of channel choice and then which product should I choose should essentially be an easy, a trivial decision for the consumer to make. So the bigger question is, how do I actually make that value proposition compelling, right? And I think, I'm going to start with sort of a tennis metaphor. I love the game. I play it a heck of a lot. And so here's my simple quiz question for everyone who's listening in, which is, what's common to Jimmy Connors, John McEnroe, Peter Sampras, Martina Hingis? I could go on. And I'll give the answer. Not only were they all great tennis players, Grand Slam winners, but none of them won the French Open. Right? And I remember actually watching a documentary on John McEnroe about 10, 15 years ago when he was actually asked about this. And he said, the single biggest mistake I used to make when I played at the Roland Garros was I brought my hard court game to clay. And it's a different surface. And as the conditions changed, I knew I should have changed my game. But a part of me just couldn't do it. I mean, I would just serve and run in. That's just the way I was hardwired. And I think we're often, as business people, as educators, doing that when we digitally transform, right? So let me be specific, right? I think the mistake we're making is we're essentially trying to recreate our physical world online. And I think that's a big mistake, right? So let me give you an example of education. That's the domain I know the most. I've written a bit about this. I've done some research. So let me start off with my claim that I think the classroom, the in-class education experience is perhaps, it's one of the most constrained teaching environments. And I mean that in a number of different, it's imperfect for a few reasons. One is we know from psychology that all of us have different chronotypes, right? So I'm at my peak at 8 o'clock in the morning. You might be at your peak at 6 in the evening. So what's the point of bringing 60 people together, all with different chronotypes at the same point in time? When most of us are not going to be at our peak, right? The internet lets us handle asynchronicity. And so we need to sort of think about using the asynchronous aspect of the internet. So that's one, right? But also the classroom favors certain kind of students. And in business school, it favors outspoken students. It favors students with long attention spans compared to ones with short. And growing up, I was attention deficit. So God, I know I've struggled through those 2-hour classes. So now that we have the capability of delivering things in bite sizes, of being able to customize different pathways for different students. Why don't we do that, right? So I'm sort of obviously, when the pandemic first hit and all of us had to move online, I understand that we had to recreate our our model of teaching from the physical world because we had times allocated for that. But now I sort of hope we will transition to a slightly more different model of teaching, right? I think we have to break our mentality that a course is 12 class meetings of 2 hours each and move that more towards what are my educational objectives and how do I best deliver them synchronously versus asynchronously, and what's the right mix. And so, many years back when I started teaching online, I had actually done a bit of research showing that a blended model is really the way to go. I mean, you want enough synchronous opportunities for the energy of the debate and all of that stuff, but you also want to create enough of a buffered zone for delivering content asynchronously so that students can think about their responses and they don't have to be pressured into saying, I agree with him, which is what we see a lot of in our MBA classrooms. And so I think understanding the capabilities of the playing field and how they're different should allow us to enhance the entire teaching mental model. And I think this is the same for all kinds of things, like, wealth management or financial advice. I mean, right? Like, as a financial advisor, you're normally constrained to giving information sequentially about different products and services, right? Now, online, you could do things simultaneously. You could actually co-create that discussion, interrupt, and you could pause and say, here are 3 ways I could go. Click on a button, tell me which one you want to hear first, and things like that, which I think we need to build in. So I guess long story short is we need to learn to play the clay court game. And that essentially means understanding the complexity or the difference in the environment and the context, and then adapting some of these things. And that's a classic behavioral phenomena is as you know, we are susceptible to biases. And one of the biggest biases that we are susceptible to is the status quo. And so if this has worked for me well in the classroom, why would it not work for me online? Well, it's the clay court, right? Yeah. So words of wisdom from John McEnroe there.
It was wonderful. You're always known for your wonderful metaphors that are funny and insightful at the same time. So that's a wonderful one. And I like how you've applied that to the challenge in education. It's a sector that I have a long background in as well. My former partner is the head of basically a chain of schools that are Academy Online, which is based on online learning, but it's a hybrid model. And pioneered the hybrid model about 10 years ago. And it's very interesting, some of the philosophies that are embedded into his business. They target careers that require licensure. So things like HVAC, different kinds of technical trades backgrounds and things that require a license in order to be able to practice. You have to go through coursework and demonstrate that through exams. But instead of offering that just fully online, the hybrid model also has a teaching facility, but it's different. It stays actually online, but you go to the campus and you register on the computers on campus. And so obviously it was before COVID-19 that they had already built out this capability. And one of the reasons that they did this was to, first of all, people can show up whenever they want, but it provides accountability. Having that accountability in an purely online channel where you don't have a time commitment, which is what many of the online courses up to COVID-19 permitted, was you log in anytime you want. But having that accountability to show up is one of the things that helps ensure student success. And another one is social pressure and the creation of a community that social pressure provides some of that benefit. Even now, his students are, they're adult learners. They're coming at education from a background that is not what we typically think about when we're thinking about a college kid, for instance. Mm-hmm. There's a very different journey or set of journeys that they have arrived from high school. These are adult learners that have had a very broad set of background and life circumstances that are bringing them here for a new learning opportunity and a new career opportunity that might actually be this like massive vector change in their lives. Typically, they'd never been to college, never would see themselves on a campus, don't fit into that world. A lot of them never even graduated from high school. Just wasn't part of their background or their family or anything that they saw. And so then this community is a community where people can fit in and to bring in some of that social norm and benchmarking. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on accountability in the online learning world, hybrid learning world, which you two believe in, and the role of community in facilitating student success.
So, I mean, absolutely, those two things are critical, and I think that's why the hybrid approach works well. Whether or not you do it in person or use other interventions, I think that's an empirical question. So, for example, today, the classes I'm teaching, we cannot do them in person, and so I would have loved to have people come in and be on premises and sort of, exchange ideas just to get a sense of what other people are doing. But you can engineer those things online, right? So for example, when we look at our discussion boards, it's important to highlight who has accomplished what and set goals for other people. And it's important to then create those local groups or subgroups. And so in some of my classes, I create local, special interest groups. I say, well, look, you know what? I've looked at the discussion boards. 6 of you have focused a lot on banking and the other 6 on packaged goods. And I'm going to create these little subgroups within my course. And I'm going to give each one of them a specific question, a specific thing to think about. And I'd like you to post responses by such and such a day so we can then share them across the class. And I think even things like that go a long way in creating that sense of community. And then I get, of course, participants coming in and say, well, you put me in the banking subgroup, but I'm also interested in that one. And it then creates those kinds of sort of, activity sets that you want to create. So I think you're absolutely right in that, there is obviously content delivery, which is an important part of any education experience, right? But there's a whole community, the enrichment piece, the application piece, and you really have to work hard at fostering that. And again, like I say, it could be through physical proximity, but it doesn't have to be. I think that's the part that a lot of people miss in taking their classes online is a lot of instructors in high schools and at universities believe that their primary goal is to educate, i.e. to provide content and impart a specific skill. But it's really that sense of, can my students use that skill? Do they have a nuanced understanding? And so little things, right? I mean, I crawl through my discussion boards and I'll pick up 2 opposite points of view. And I'll say, well, look, John just gave this example of A causing B, and Jill just gave this example where apparently the opposite is true. A did not cause B. What do you think is going on, right? And so we push the students to come up with nuanced thinking. And again, these are things that are really hard to do in a brick and mortar world because just keeping track of what everyone said is difficult. Whereas now I can do that. I can let students express themselves in whatever language they want. And I have students now, for example, writing text messages. There are some that do audio recordings. That there are some that sketch ideas out. And I think that's the kind of stuff that you don't get to see in the brick and mortar classroom. So I do think as long as you harness the ability of the digital world, then you can actually create a value proposition that even pushes people out of the comfort zone and challenges status quo. So I think it's really up to us to understand what the clay code is capable of doing or not.
Yes. Yes, and I really love the point that you made about the role of the teacher is more than just about providing the content. As rich as that content is,
That's
as
right.
difficult as it is to create good, meaningful content, and like you said, I don't want to dismiss the value of that, but
Correct.
the challenge and for me as well as an educator is recognizing that there has to be space
Mm-hmm.
for the students to interact with, test and provide a framework for that understanding through the application. So that means surrendering some of those incredible concepts that you think that they absolutely need, and in order to allow for more space for interactivity, play, understanding.
And Kelly, I imagine as a CEO, you face some of that similar, point of view as well, as you want to develop people. And I mean, I had this like really interesting interaction with one of our Bear team members last year. They made mistakes. They were working on a project. They eventually got to where we were. And finally, this particular project lead comes to me and says, "You knew all along what this project was going to look like in the end, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, why didn't you just let us?" And I said, "You wouldn't have been who you are today if I just told you what to do." And he agreed. And I think that's really it. As a good leader, more generally, be it in education, be it in business, I think it's important, developing talent. And so my other quick comment I was going to make when you were telling me about this person and the accreditation academy that they run online is maybe they should be doing one for behavioral scientists as well. To go beyond sort of just an application perspective to developing some sort of a science. I mean, it's something we need in the field today, don't we?
It's in the works.
It's an excellent.
That's
Excellent.
That we haven't had a chance to chat with you about. But
Fantastic. Excellent. Good to know.
just already to talk with you about the work that we're doing there. So just sticking with education, the for-profit education sector has the online for-profit education sector has been at this for many years,
Mm-hmm.
and we're all bringing traditional academies online because we have to, but there's been for-profit that's been innovating and serving in that space for quite some time. And they face challenges. The student populations are different.
Mm-hmm.
In an advanced, MBA course, and that's with people that have their path on certain careers that they're trying to mobilize themselves into, or upskill, or enhance, or augment their prior academic work. So many of the students are experienced as and experienced professionals. And so they have a different set of life challenges than where much of the for-profit education sector has tried to serve the underserved community in the education space. And that's presented some really complicated challenges, things like graduation rates in the online model. Now, potentially it is profitable to serve these geographically disparate populations without the overhead cost of brick and mortar. Teachers are able to serve larger groups and have assistants help with things like grading and student support. Nevertheless, those graduation rates are tough to achieve. And some of that is because they don't have that level of interactivity between the teacher and student that's really able to happen. Some of it is the student behaviors and practices aren't as demanding. I know that the students at Rotman are very demanding and expect nothing less than attention and facilitation and innovation, which is amazing. But the for-profit education sector is constrained in many ways. What would be some of the things that you would think about to help that sector be able to itself use this pandemic as a chance to grow?
Yeah. So a few things. And as you know, I've been teaching an online course, BE 101X, now for about 8 years. It's taken a life of its own. I remember when I started doing that, I wasn't quite sure how long it's going to continue. Dan used to teach a course on Coursera at that point in time. And now about 280,000 registrations later, every time the course comes to a close, I get a flood of messages saying, put it back on. And so it's still there, but I've learned a lot of things there. So one of the things I learned, obviously, was the low completion rates that you talked about. And initially, I used to read all of this research on MOOCs and the fact that if you end up with a 1% completion rate, you should be happy. And maybe no more than 10% of people will complete all of your modules. And I accomplished that. And I guess one easy thing would have been for me to say, okay, I'm happy, I've met the benchmarks. But I tried to find out a little bit more. And one of the things I learned was in my MOOC, for example, there were certain parts of the world where the completion rates were particularly low, as in people didn't finish the exams that they needed to finish to get a certificate. But these were also the parts of the world where I used to get the most engagement from. So the best questions, the best professor, here's what I'm working on and how would behavioral science help me kind of questions, right? And so I ended up traveling to some of these countries over the past 8 years. I met with some participants from the MOOC at that point in time. And I learned that they actually didn't care about the certificate. It wasn't why they were there. They wanted to actually get useful knowledge. And as long as they got that, they didn't care about finishing the course, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to get to is we've tried to adopt our university type metrics to a lot of these digital education platforms. And we've said in university, you're successful if you finish a course, if you get a report card, if you get a diploma. I actually don't think that's true in the digital world. I mean, I've consumed a lot of content. I've been the other party, right? I taught myself some machine learning online, and I didn't finish the courses. I didn't get the certificate, right? But I learned some really good stuff there. And I think we've got to think about the heterogeneity in what the educational goal is. And again, this is where technology can help design a course, for example, that has the same basic frame, it's the same content, but you can put people through different pathways through that content, right? So I'm actually working on one right now where, exactly like you said, there are people who are slightly more senior, who know the basics. There are some people there who are there to learn the basics and just the content. There are some who want to do their jobs differently. And my approach is a lunch buffet approach, is you put out a platter of different things and you guide people through it. All right. And you say, well, look, here's module 1, that's the basics. Here's module 2, that's the method. Here's module 3, applications. If you know the basics, well, learn the methods, learn the application. If you only want to know the basics, do module 1, right? You can look at 2 and 3 if you want to, but that's not your focus. And then even within each module, you can actually create pathways, right? And I think that's what we need to do. And at the end of the day, even on digital learning, when we collect our feedback from our participants, we use the same metrics as we use for the online for the offline world, which is nonsense, right? And I think we need to ask them questions that had to do with what their goal was in coming to this particular course and whether that goal was met. And yeah, is it more difficult to do? Obviously, it's difficult to do, but I think it's much more meaningful data. So I think we have to embrace the heterogeneity of our participants a lot better. But again, online lets us do that, right? I mean, I could not imagine doing a buffet type course in a brick and mortar world. But online, you can do that.
So that's what brings us to the challenge then of regulation. So one of the things that constrains innovation, ironically, with these early innovators in the for-profit education sector is education regulation that mandates everything from graduation rates, a curriculum, a style of learning, and holds hostage the ability to accept students who are funded by a government-backed loan. Mm-hmm. And that regulation is not in the spirit of the kind of educational choice that you're talking about. I want to put that forward for you because you've done so much work on the policy side that you understand both worlds. You like me, cross this chasm between educator and practitioner, aligned to the commercial needs and the spirit of a healthy or just capitalism, tempered by a healthy and evidence-based policy. I think you and I are there's a lot of kind of philosophical alignment between us. And so I'd love to get your point of view on the role of, and also just understand what you're seeing from your position at Rotman and chairmanship. How is it going right now? How are we facilitating innovation against that mandate? How do we, and then maybe even more meta, how do we facilitate innovation and leverage evidence-based approaches to help policymakers allow change, allow disruption?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you've asked like a really complex question. I could spend the entire day on this, but let me try and organize my thoughts a little bit. So I'll free flow for a couple of minutes, and then I'll hopefully put some structure on this. So let me start off by putting on the table the fact that I am a supporter of appropriate levels of regulation. I'm not one of those people who says we need no regulation, because we know that consumers need help. I mean, we create societies where we let people make their own choices, but we also know that they can't make those choices very well. And so there's a bit of a paradox that we then also oppose regulation. So I think regulation, to the extent that it protects people, it pads the environment, it makes the consequence of a bad decision not disastrous, I think is great, right? I also think that a truly unregulated innovation ecosystem where we reward quick wins, which is what the venture capital model has actually done, it ends up favoring certain kinds of innovation, right? And this is not my claim. There's a sociologist at Chicago called Galenson who's written some fantastic papers and books on this. And he sort of talks about a slow innovation versus a quick innovation. There was a talk that someone gave. I'm trying to remember who it was at Bear many years back. Malcolm Gladwell, actually, where he compared the sort of a creative production of a band like the Eagles with Fleetwood Mac. These are both bands I love. I suspect you like both of them, but they're very different, right? I mean, you think about Fleetwood Mac, from the time they began, personnel changes, people fighting with each other, disagreements, change of style, to the time that they had their first really big hit. It was a number of years, right? The Eagles came from nowhere. They had 3 boom, boom, boom back-to-back hits. And then I think in what was probably their greatest act of audacity, their 4th album, I think, was the greatest hits. It's like, in academia, your 3rd paper is like, the legacy of my research, right? And then they were gone. And I think Galenson sort of makes the distinction between sort of the adaptive kind of innovation where you slowly work on things. It's a lot more like science, that sort of innovation, right? Whereas, it's not about the flashy findings. It's about refining theory. Like the best scientists have worked on their craft for years. I mean, they've done experiments, and then they've not said that this is the truth. They've said, let me try this somewhere else, and let me now try it with these other conditions. And then it's about 10 years before they can then produce a theory of how the world works. And I think then there's the flashy ones, right? Like I write 10 papers about 10 completely unrelated things, but they're exciting. People are surprised. And I think we've tended to favor those quick win innovations. We've tended to favor the Eagles as opposed to the Fleetwood Macs, right? And I think that's the other thing I worry about in behavioral science, in the world more generally, is I think we've just become more flashy with our innovations. And I think COVID has shown that, right? Like, we've had all these innovations over the past 10, 15 years, but the world doesn't seem to be any more stable than it was. from the time of the big recession. And so what's actually happened is we've got lots of these individual flashy things happening, but the trajectory hasn't really improved. And I think that's the other thing that we as society need to think about, right? Is do we, if regulation provides a friction to the flashy kind of innovation, but it encourages the slow burn kind of innovation, I'm all for it. I think we need to think more about that. I think we need to think about financing models differently. So, be it in education, be it in business, right? You produce a quick win, you get funding. And then you produce a next quick win, you get your second round of funding. But nobody's going to give you like a 10-year highway or runway to produce like the big theory, right? And I think that those are the kinds of things we need to start thinking about in the ecosystem. But getting back to this whole notion of the triangulation between policy and business and innovation, I'll give you the example of some work we did a few years back on the privacy, online privacy stuff. I think you were involved in some of those discussions as well. But every time you speak to the policy folks separately and the business folks separately, there is this belief that this is basically a zero-sum game, right? Is if I concede, the other side is going to gain stuff. So, as regulation goes up, innovation is going to go down. If the government pushes for more online privacy, I'm going to be able to do less with it, right? And I actually don't think that's true. And what it took that instance in that project is really, I think you were there. We had this roundtable in the atrium at Rotman where we had, I think, the Googles and the Facebooks of the world sitting with the Ministry of Government Services, sitting with the Privacy Commissioner's office. And we realized within an hour or so that we all wanted the same thing. I mean, we wanted there to be innovation. We wanted, we wanted consumers to be protected. But we believe that the other person wanted something else. And I think just kind of getting people in the same room and identifying the core elements of what's common to their needs, I think is critical. And that doesn't happen. And I think that's where, centers like ours and, shops like yours, where we bring these people together, I think play a big role, because at the end of the day, these are complex challenges. And unless we explore what the shared common values are, we're just not going to make any progress. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's my take on the whole policy versus innovation debate.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful. I think that contextualizing the types of innovation and, which is the one that will have that longer term lasting legacy, and kind of having permission to do things more slowly. By challenging venture capitalism, by challenging regulators, by challenging entrepreneurs to think about things with a lasting legacy is what we need as a way to qualify innovation.
I think so. And I think, like I say, I think the trajectory has to be upwards overall. If you take away all of the fluff, and I don't mean fluff in a negative way, but if you clear the splatter from your kitchen, are you left with a better dish at the end of it is the question, right? And the pandemic has kind of showed us that, maybe our systems aren't that stronger. Despite all of this innovation, we've got lots of cool stuff to look at, but that's what it is. It's cool stuff. So I think we do need to think a lot about how we can fix that.
Yeah, and so one of the solutions that you put forward was this idea of these kind of public-private hubs where we bring the entrepreneurs, the educators, the academics, the regulators together to find those common goals and work towards a solution. So I think as soon as we have the pandemic under control, I think we have an opportunity, certainly in the for-profit education space, to bring the regulators together to see if we can all get aligned on that sector. Absolutely. To help more people have access to education, regardless of what their own academic history might be.
Yeah, I do think that our mental models of education will change. I think our students' mental models of education will change. I think we've heard all of these stories about people without college degrees going on to do great things, and that's fine. But again, the question really is, it's not the degree that matters, it's the education. And I think as long as we've created opportunities for students to learn those things somewhere, whether or not they leave with a piece of paper saying you now have a degree. I think also, what's happened in the world is even 10, 15 years ago, it was harder to test for skills. I mean, if I wanted to see whether Kelly Peters was great at creating engagement, I mean, I just had to believe you. And you convinced me by showing me your diploma from the best possible advertising institute. Today, I'm just going to have you put up a campaign and say, well, let's see how many hits you can drive to your website. And I think it's just becoming easier to identify skills, right? So I think, therefore, the value of the paperwork is going to go down. But it's really these teachable skills that I think we need to focus on.
Awesome. So what would you say is the next thing that you're thinking about right now in terms of behavioral science? What do you have time for right now?
Oh, gosh. Lots of things, but maybe two in particular. So as you know, we have this behaviorally informed organizations initiative at the center. And Kelly, you've been an amazing supporter, as well as the rest of your team. And I think that's our next big hurdle. So two things there. One is this question of how do we best embed the science in organizations, right? I think nudge changed our world. Cass Sunstein wrote a beautiful book called How Change Happens. So we can actually look back at the evolution of behavioral science in retrospect, and it fits the model, right? A lot of things happened. 2008, Nudge got written. Just before that, Dan had written his book. So we had a lot of popular science floating around that I think created the ingredient for people to say, that sounds interesting, right? And I remember in 2012, you and I had this conversation where we said, all these people saying, nudge is cool, how do I get started? And so, we worked on this practitioner's guide together. And I think that was the other big trigger. BEworks was set up, Bear was set up. I think all of these things started, and then I guess the biggest catalyst was Richard Thaler winning the Nobel Prize. I think that gets you more eyeballs, more attention than anything else. And so all of that has been great, but I do think we now need to go to the next level, which is every organization I know of, well, maybe not every, as a good scientist, I should never say every and never, right? But most organizations are still using behavioral science as a problem-solving device, right? I've put up a new product, nobody's buying it. What do I do? I've got a welfare program, people aren't taking it up. And I think we need to go beyond that. I think we need to embed that into every single process, every single mechanism that the organization works on. So getting it into the organization is one thing. And I think then the other thing we need to think about is scaling it up. So again, a lot of the wonderful work that's been done in the field is still at the level of a pilot. So, I mean, I'm happy, for example, when I work in Mexico, we've touched about, 500,000 lives, but that's still just 500,000, right? It's a huge country. And so how do we scale it up? And I think that's the other big question is we've seen John List and others have this fantastic word they use, the notion of voltage drop, right? Is every time you take an intervention that works so amazingly well in the lab or in a pilot, and you scale it up to the population, effects are very small compared to what you saw in the lab, right? And so how do we actually reduce that voltage drop, to me, is a big question. So I'd say those are the two big things that kind of keep me occupied.
Yeah, well, we're thinking about the same things.
I think so.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I'm happy we had a chance to do a deep dive on education. It's something that all of us are watching, whether or not you have children or young adults in school, or you're thinking about going back to school yourself. Looking at the role of innovation in transforming how education can potentially be a silver lining out of this. And I'm very happy that it's a problem that you're preoccupied with right now, because I very much believe that education is essential to helping transform society.
Yeah, and I'll go back to something I said, and I want to link that to Dan and some of my previous writing. So I know Dan really speaks a lot about rocket ships and having the fuel and making it easy to navigate. And I talk a lot as an engineer. I talk about pipelines. And so I've always said that behavior change is like a plumbing problem, right? Like step one, make sure there's a pressure differential across the pipes because that's what gets the fluid to flow from point A to point B. And step B, keep the pipes clean and make sure they're not leaking. And I think it's as simple as that. And I think we need to apply that to everything. So back to education, right? There's a motivation story. How do we keep people engaged? And then there's a making it easy story. And I would actually go so far as to say, and obviously the devil is in the details, but I think this simple metaphor, be it the rocket ship or the pipeline, I think explains a lot of our behavior change challenges. And I think sometimes they don't work because we just focus on the one and not the other, right? We can nudge people, but if they're not motivated, they're not going to make their way through the pipeline. Or you can motivate them, but if the pipeline is choked, they can't make it through the pipeline. So I think we just have to make sure we get those two things right at the same time.
All right. Well, once again, your metaphors have a way of being so illustrative of a concept. So thank you very much for your time today. And I'm very excited about sharing this interview with others.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kelly. And thanks for having me.